Propaganda is often misunderstood as mere misinformation or blatant political messaging. But in its true sense, it is far more structured and intentional process. At its core, propaganda is the strategic shaping of perception. It is not concerned with presenting reality in its entirety, but with selecting, framing, and repeating specific elements of reality in a way that influences how people interpret the world around them. Unlike neutral communication, which aims to inform, propaganda aims to guide, quietly directing attention, emotion, and judgment toward a desired outcome. The defining characteristic of propaganda is not whether the information it presents is true or false. In many cases, propaganda contains facts. What distinguishes it is the way those facts are arranged, emphasized, or isolated. By highlighting certain details while ignoring others, it constructs a version of reality that feels complete even when it is partial. Over time, repeated exposure to this curated version creates familiarity, and familiarity gradually transforms into acceptance. Historically, propaganda has been closely associated with periods of conflict and consolidation of power. During the early 20th century, particularly around World War I, governments began to systematically organize communication efforts to influence public opinion at scale. The objective was not only to inform citizens about the war, but to shape their emotional and psychological engagement with it. Narratives were crafted to generate unity, justify actions, and define clear distinctions between allies and enemies. This marked a shift from communication as information delivery to communication as a psychological strategy. This approach was further refined during World War II, where propaganda became an integral part of state machinery. Visual media, radio broadcasts, and cinema were used not only to communicate events but to construct entire belief systems. The role of propaganda expanded beyond wartime necessity into a continuous process of maintaining ideological alignment within population. It demonstrated that influence over perception could be as decisive as control over territory. However, limiting propaganda to governments or wartime contexts create an incomplete picture. The underlying mechanisms, selection, repetition, emotional appeal, and control of visibility are not exclusive to political systems. They are adaptable tools. As societies evolved, these tools found applications in new domains, including commerce, media, and culture. Advertising, for instance, does not simply present products. It constructs associations, desires, and identities around them. In doing so, it operates on principles remarkably similar to those historically used in political propaganda. What makes propaganda particularly effective is its subtlety. It does not require coercion or overt enforcement. Instead, it operates within the normal flow of information, blending seamlessly into everyday experiences. It relies on patterns rather than singular messages, consistent exposure, reinforcement, and the gradual narrowing of perceived alternatives. When executed effectively, it does not feel like influence at all, it feels like common sense. Understanding propaganda, therefore, requires moving beyond the idea of isolated messages and examining the systems that produce and distribute them. It is not a single act, but a sustained process. It is not defined by the medium it uses, but by the use of intent and structure behind it. And most importantly, it is not something that exists only in the past or in distant political regimes. It is a dynamic mechanism, one that continues to evolve alongside the ways in which information is created, shared, and consumed. Propaganda does not operate randomly. It follows a set of underlying mechanisms that make it effective across different contexts, whether in politics, media, or commerce. These mechanisms are not always visible, but they are consistent. Understanding them reveals that propaganda is less about individual messages and more about patterns of influence. The first mechanism is selection. Every act of communication involves choosing what to include and what to exclude, but propaganda makes this selection intentional and strategic. Instead of presenting a full picture, it highlights specific aspects of reality while leaving others out. This creates a controlled frame through which events are interpreted. What is omitted is often as important as what is shown, because absence limits the range of possible conclusions a person can draw. The second mechanism is framing. Once information is selected, it is presented in a way that guides interpretation. The same event can be described in multiple ways, but propaganda chooses the version that produces a desired emotional or cognitive response. Language plays a central role here. Words are not neutral. Labels, tone, and emphasis subtly shape whether something is perceived as positive, negative, urgent, or insignificant. Over time, repeated framing establishes a default way of understanding certain issues. The third mechanism is repetition. A single message rarely changes belief. Propaganda relies on continuous exposure. When an idea is encountered repeatedly across different contexts, it begins to feel familiar. Familiarity reduces resistance. People are more likely to accept ideas that feel known, even if they have not critically examined them. Repetition also creates the illusion of consensus. If something is heard often enough, it starts to seem widely accepted. The fourth mechanism is emotional activation. Propaganda is rarely built on logic alone. It engages emotions such as fear, pride, anger, or belonging. Emotional responses are faster and more powerful than analytical thinking, and they influence how information is processed. By linking messages to emotional triggers, propaganda reduces the likelihood of critical evaluation. Instead of asking whether something is accurate, individuals respond to how it makes them feel. The fifth mechanism is simplification. Complex realities are reduced into clear, digestible narratives. This often involves creating binaries: right versus wrong, us versus them, success versus failure. Simplification makes information easier to consume and share, but it also removes nuance. When complexity is stripped away, alternative perspectives become harder to recognize and the simplified version becomes dominant. The sixth mechanism is authority and credibility cues. Messages are more easily accepted when they appear to come from trusted sources. Propaganda often uses symbols of authority, experts, institutions, or familiar figures to reinforce its claims. Even when the content itself is not deeply examined, the presence of credibility signals increases acceptance. Over time, repeated association between certain sources and certain ideas strengthens their perceived legitimacy. The seventh mechanism is normalization. As messages are repeated, framed, and reinforced, they begin to feel normal. What once may have seemed unusual or questionable becomes part of everyday understanding. Normalization does not require agreement from everyone, it only requires enough visibility that alternatives' views appear less prominent or less valid. These mechanisms do not operate in isolation, they interact and reinforce each other. Selection determines what is visible, framing shapes how it is understood, Repetition strengthens familiarity, emotional activation drives engagement, simplification makes it accessible, authority adds credibility, and normalization embeds it into everyday thinking. The effectiveness of propaganda lies in this combination. It is not a single technique, but a coordinated process. When these mechanisms align, influence becomes gradual, consistent, and difficult to detect. Individuals may believe they are forming independent opinions, while in reality, those opinions are being shaped within a carefully constructed informational environment. Understanding these mechanisms does not eliminate their influence, but it makes them visible, and visibility is the first step towards recognizing when perception is being guided rather than freely formed.